Okay, so I'm going to talk about transition to adulthood, which is actually a very exciting topic for me to talk about, particularly because I have two children who are on their way to being adults. So one of the things, I have a, let me just, there we go. Okay, so that's me and my two kids. I'm Dr. Melissa Bailey. That's Roxy and Alex. And they both have diagnoses of autism. Alex is higher functioning than Roxanne, and Roxy's a little lower functioning. So that's them probably about 10 years ago. Alex is now 15 and Roxy's 15 and Alex is 17. So they were diagnosed back when we lived in California. Alex was diagnosed approximately 2 years, 8 months, and Roxanne was diagnosed probably about 2 years, 6 months. So we've been dealing with autism for quite a while. So, and I think one of the things that parents don't really think about is how are we going to move ahead once they become adults? When they're cute little kids, you know, sometimes a little easier, not always. So just a little bit about me. I have Bailey Psychology Group. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been doing this now probably close to 25 years. I was trained in Chicago at the Illinois School of Professional Psychology and Health Psychology. And then I moved to California, where I lived for about 15 years, where I did therapy. And then once the kids became diagnosed with autism, I kind of became an autism expert and also attempting to help others with helping get services for their children. Now, one of the things that's different about California versus Florida is that if you think your child or an adult has a developmental disability, then you are actually able to get a free evaluation at what's called the regional centers. And the regional centers in California are divided up according to catchment areas. So if, for example, both of my kids were assessed there, and since they were assessed there, I became somewhat of an expert. And up until recently, I was still flying back and forth between here and California, where I was doing those type of evaluations. Autism evaluations, I also do psychoeducational evaluations out in California and other states. If you think your child is not receiving the services that they need at school, you can actually ask for an independent one. Not everyone here in Florida, not all the counties are really good about doing that. And actually, that's actually paid by the school district in some places. So Bailey Psychology Group, I conduct psychological testing. I also do consultation. We do therapy. I have a number of therapists who work with me, one of which works particularly with little kids related to attention deficit, hyperactivity, behavior problems, different things like that. I usually specialize in working with, obviously, people on the spectrum throughout the age span, from little kids all the way up to adults. I also do psychoeducational testing. This is something that I have found a huge need here in Florida because a lot of families don't get the testing that they need. And unfortunately, since I've been here in Florida, I have actually assessed a lot of adults who probably should have been caught early on about that they were on the spectrum. So I can't even tell you how many of those I've done since I've moved here. So the other thing that I am also involved with is I am a contractor for vocational rehabilitation, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about. I think it's one of the gems in the rough here in Florida. So I definitely want to make sure that we talk about that because that is a really important service as kids transition to adulthood. So just a little bit about, I know we've heard from some other people today, and oftentimes people don't know the difference between psychiatrists, psychologists, how is it that we work, and what are some of the things that we do. Psychologists come in all different forms, and they specialize in all different areas. We can have psychologists that specifically are doing autism assessments. Some of them just really work with depression and anxiety. But in terms of the diagnostic process for a child or a young adult who has a disability, in general, it's the psychologist who is able to actually give a diagnosis of autism or any diagnosis that's in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, 5th edition. Whereas, for example, sometimes parents will come and say, well, my child's been diagnosed with autism through the school district. Well, technically that's a special education classification. It's not actually a diagnosis. So in order to get services, usually you have to have a psychologist conduct a psychoeducational or psychological evaluation with specific assessments. So the role of the psychologist can also be involved in doing the assessments prior to getting, let's say, ABA therapy. Most ABA therapy, in order to be authorized by any type of behavior therapy service, is going to require an evaluation by a psychologist. You know, 20 years ago when my kids were little, you just really needed a prescription from your doctor saying that they needed ABA therapy, but the insurance companies have actually made it a little bit more difficult to do that. So that's one of the reasons why getting the assessment is so important. Some of the things that are involved with psychoeducational evaluations, which again is really important for high schoolers to make sure that they have a very good, accurate psychoeducational evaluation. Because that's going to help set up the individualized education plan, and that's going to include transition to adulthood services. So we want to make sure that as we're preparing for moving ahead with adulthood, that a lot of these assessments that we should be able to get done either through the school district or privately are done prior to 18, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Some of the other things that I work with parents on is I try and help educate them how to best advocate for their child. For example, a lot of parents don't know that in order to get extra services for your child, you really have to put everything in writing. If you don't put things in writing, technically the school district doesn't have to do anything. So I always encourage parents to make sure that they put something in writing, they bring it to the school district, hand it to the assistant principal, hand it to the special education teacher, and then also hand it or email it to the special education district, whoever that coordinator might be. And then obviously the role of the psychologist throughout all of this is providing support. Some of the things I want to talk about today, there's Alex and Roxanne, a little bit older. That is a rare photo of them together. Usually Alex will not go near Roxanne. So I always have that issue with the two of them. So some of the things we're going to look at today as I talk are going to include identifying different needs for your child moving into the transition, finding resources, advocating for your child. Should we talk about guardianship or not? And then obviously dealing with the emotional component of having an adult child with disabilities. I think that's a really important thing for those of us who have children who are going to transition into adulthood with disabilities, because it is somewhat of a different emotional experience, I think, than people who, you know, drop off their neurotypical kids at college. We have a whole different bag we have to deal with, parents who have to deal with this. So one of the first things when we're looking at transition to adulthood is thinking about where is your child at now. That's going to kind of make a difference in terms of what steps we're going to take. If your child is in public school, for example, they can go through graduation. They can get a special education diploma. So for example, in my area, I see a lot of children, and also my daughter goes to Countryside High School. So several of the children that are teenagers or young adults who I work with, several of them have turned 18, we're supposed to walk and graduate this year. Obviously with COVID, they were not able to, but they actually were able to give that opportunity to graduate. However, it's very important to know that if for some reason that your child just graduates at the end of high school and then you don't do anything else, a lot of adult services don't start till age 22. So it's important to know that in public schools anyway, your child can attend programming until age 22. And I highly recommend that. For example, several of the students who I see in therapy who graduated from Countryside High School, they're actually going to go to community-based training services that Pinellas County offers. So for example, one of them is going to help learn how to do some basic skills like maybe cleaning, bussing tables, doing a coffee cart. Another one, I know one of my other kids who I saw, it has a lot more to do with art. And so those are all different things that we want to make sure we look at before the kids graduate. I can't tell you how many nightmare stories I have heard about school districts just graduating some of these kids who need the extended services at age 18. I have a particular girl who was out of Hillsborough County. They graduated her, did an emergency IEP just so she could graduate, and then dropped her. Well, she ended up having a diagnosis of not only autism, but also an intellectual disability, even though she looked a lot higher functioning than what she was. So now mom is stuck because a lot of the programs through adult programs don't start until age 22 because they're expecting that the school district is going to take care of it. So you really want to know what opportunities are out there for your public school before you just graduate your child. Another good example is I had a child here, an adult in Pinellas County, who they did actually an emergency IEP like 3 days before graduation because he had failed math. And then they also graduated him. Well, when the family brought him in because he was not able to go to community college on his own, he needed a lot of assistance. Come to find out, this person also had high functioning autism, but had borderline IQ. So they should never have been graduated. So it's very important that you're educated about what your school district will offer. If your child's in private school, also some of the private schools will do graduation as well. So for example, my son goes to Keystone Prep in Odessa. He's going to be a senior next year. And do I think he's going to be ready for college after that? Absolutely not. But he turns 18 in October. This particular school does offer an additional year, like a transition year, so to speak, kind of like a college prep year. So we may or may not be doing that. Since Alex is a little higher functioning, trying to explain to him why he would spend another year at his school is probably going to be a difficult discussion. So we may have to look at other options for him. Some of the other options I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. And again, some of the private schools like Center Academy, Dunedin Prep, some of the ones that if your child is in a private school, they may be eligible for an extended program or community-based instruction or CBI. There's several private schools in the area that are able to do that. So if you're in private school with, say, either the Gardner or the McKay Scholarship, remember you can still utilize that and continue to utilize those, especially if your child is disabled enough to take advantage of the extended programs. If your child's homeschooled, okay, you want to consider what other services do you have that's involved with that. Now, my experience that I've had with teenagers who have been homeschooled, generally once you put a teenager in homeschooling, it's very difficult to get them out of the house. So I would definitely recommend for parents who are homeschooling to make sure that you have your teenager involved in extracurricular activities, expose them as much as you can to social opportunities, because otherwise they're not coming out of their room. I have several families who I saw, they decided to do homeschooling, and then they come back to me when the young adult is 20, 21 saying, we don't know what to do with him, he won't leave his room. So I think it's important to start preparing ahead of time with all of those types of things. So first of all, consider where your child is at. Planning starts now. Okay, here's a picture of Roxy at Disneyland. See how little and cute she is? So, before I knew it, blink of an eye, there she is. We're in Fort Myers there. Now she's 15 years old. And she's my one who's a lot lower functioning. She has limited language skills. So unfortunately, as much as it breaks my heart, I have to start thinking about, okay, what's going to happen when she turns 18? And my experience with working with many parents on this issue is that they prefer to put their head in the sand about that because you just don't want to think about You know, what am I going to do with my child who's disabled once they turn 18 or once they're no longer in school? So we want to start planning now. As difficult as it is, just even listening to a talk like this is going to help you kind of get the wheels moving in terms of what do I need to do next to try and help my child. Because guess what? They're not kids anymore. There's Alex looking so cute as Peter Pan when he was little. He's probably about 4 there. Well, now, as you see, we just got a new kitten that was actually found outside my window. And then there's Alex now, 250 pounds, almost 5'10". So he's definitely not a child anymore, but he's definitely not ready to be on his own either. So I think it's important to think about transition. As much as many of our young teenagers may seem like they're incredibly immature, once they turn 18, they're legally an adult. And we need to plan for that, because if we don't, we're going to have some problems. So one of the things I usually recommend with parents, not that we don't have enough to do anyway, that's why I have that meme there, is that those of us with special needs kids, it's even more exhausting when we think that they're going to be nice and independent as teenagers. Some of us who have children who are more affected, you know, I can't leave Roxanne alone, and I'm sure there's many other families out there who feel the same way. So it's still difficult as we move into teenage young adulthood. Some of the things I encourage some of the families who I work with who have teenagers or young adults in therapy who have disabilities is I encourage you to start now. For example, I probably am a little bit harder on Alex than most parents, only because he is not going to have me for his entire life, probably. So I'm a little bit more strict with him about, okay, picking up your room, you know, getting up on time, working on schedules, making sure we have routines in place. You know, this is not a kid that I'm going to trust just to, okay, bedtime, go ahead and go. No, okay, we have our routine. You have to take a shower. Did you brush your teeth? Did you put on deodorant? You know, all those things you never think that you're going to say as a parent. Also with kids, particularly kids on the spectrum, it's very important to discuss things in terms of rules, because children and young adults who are on the spectrum generally have very black and white rigid thinking. So as a parent now on your day-to-day life, if you see your child doing something socially inappropriate, for example, you do want to make sure that you kind of set the rule. So for example, even more so now with COVID, you know, if you have a child who tends to get into someone else's space when you're out in public, you know, you want to talk about, okay, Tommy, the rule is that we have this bubble around us and we don't want to, you know, go into somebody else's space. We want to make sure we keep this bubble around us. That's the rule. When we talk in terms of black and white and rules, lots of times kids on the spectrum or who have intellectual disabilities are going to understand that more than us trying to lecture them. One of the things I find difficult, one of the things I find that parents will do is that they'll attempt to lecture their child who has intellectual disability, or if they're on the spectrum, and what happens is it goes in one ear and out the other. We need to have, okay, this is specifically what you're supposed to do. This is how we're supposed to do it. The other thing is working on assertiveness. For example, one of the things I make Alex do is that if he wants something, if we're at a restaurant, he needs to go up and get up and ask for it. I have a ton of neurotypical teenagers who won't get up and get a straw. They'll make their mom do it, or they won't order at a restaurant, things like that. These are neurotypical kids who are doing that. We want to make sure that we also are working with our children to be more assertive and also be taking care of themselves out when they're in public so they can get their needs met. Sometimes they can go a little overboard, I know, but you want to make sure, again, that you're putting those rules in. Another thing is obviously working on activities of daily living. You know, one of the things I recommended to parents during COVID is this is a great time to teach some of those home ec skills that a lot of students don't get anymore. You know, do they know how to sew a button? Would they know how to make a simple meal for themselves? Would they know what to do in case of an emergency? All of those different things are basic things that we should be teaching our children with disabilities so that they have an understanding of that when, you know, they are an adult, because a lot of them don't know that. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody, say, who's like a 23-year-old person on the spectrum, I ask them, well, what do you do in case of an emergency? Well, I call mom. Well, what if mom's the one having the emergency? And then they don't have an answer for that. So start now in an attempt to prepare. You're not being mean, you're not being harsh, you're being realistic. I was doing this, I had a middle schooler in therapy who was high functioning autism, and he decided he had enough of me. And so he just got up, didn't say a word, and walked out. And I was like, hey, I'm like, that's not how you leave a room. I'm like, you need to sit back down, say, excuse me, I think I'm done, or something like that. You just don't walk out in the middle of a conversation. So I made him sit back down and do it in front of Dad. So the next time he comes in, he had had enough of me, which is fine. But this time he said, you know what, thank you very much. I've had enough. I think I'm going to go in the waiting room. And so I had to speak to Dad about that. And I said, Dad, this is how you need to be talking to him. He's like, well, I don't want to seem rude. And I was like, you're not being rude. First of all, he doesn't really understand rude. Two, these are some basic skills that as you see him doing things that he's not supposed to or are not socially acceptable, you need to point those things out. You're doing a disservice if you don't. So make sure, again, preparing your children for transition to adulthood, sometimes you have to be a little rougher on them. You know, don't parent out of guilt is one of my mantras, because you're not doing your child any good if you do that. That goes for neurotypical kids as well. Kids need boundaries no matter what. The other thing that I recommend that parents do, if they haven't already done, is that you want to start keeping a record, whether it's digital or if you have a big old file box, of all of their assessments, their IEPs, reports, grades, anything like that. Because what's going to happen when we go to get adult services is that those types of documents are going to be asked for. And also, it's going to also document that your child has a disability and has had a disability for quite a while. That's going to be really important, for example, if you're going to go for Social Security disability services once they become an adult. If they don't have any record other than their IEP, that they've had an assessment, that they've had therapies, things like that, it's going to be more difficult to get those services. So I highly recommend that parents put together a file that's going to be very easy, so that when you start accessing some of these services, that you're going to have all of that information right at hand. It's going to make things a lot easier. These are some of the different pointers that I have for parents that it was also taken from tips and tools for transitions. Again, one of the things you want to think about in terms of transition is, you know, what is your child, your son or daughter, what do they want to do with their life? You know, sometimes at this age, you know, this age meaning 15 and 17-year-old, they may not have any idea. I have a lot of kids who are like, I don't know, I want to play video games all day. Well, it's probably not exactly the direction we want them to think about. As you're out and about with your teenager, I encourage parents to point out what some of the different careers are that they're seeing. So for example, if they're seeing some different, you know, if you're out at a restaurant, point out some of the different things that they're doing, right? Because you want to know what are some of the things that, I'm just reading some of the notes here, okay. Oops. So some of the things that you want to do is you want to look at specifically what are some of their likes and dislikes. Like I said, you want to start early. Transition services and looking at transition to adulthood should start at age 14. So, and you know, try and be realistic about your teens' needs, abilities, and skills. I think that's one of the things that parents, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but sometimes as parents, we know our kids, so we kind of overestimate their abilities in real life because we know how wonderful they are in certain areas. But when we're looking at getting services, that's not something that we necessarily want to highlight, so to speak. Also encourage your teen to attend the transition or IEP planning meetings if they're capable of doing that. I think that's a personal choice. I think it's important, especially before they do turn 18, for them to do that if you feel that they're capable and are going to understand that. If they're not going to understand it, then I think that's a choice that you can make. Also, look at academic or practical. You know, not all kids are going to go to college or go to community college. Some of them may be doing a day program. Some of them may need to get specialized training. We need to have a better understanding and assessment of where our kids' skills, functioning level, and needs are. Also, every community is different. Since I've moved here to Florida, I have unfortunately found them not to have a whole lot of great adult services, but there are some diamonds in the rough, which I'm going to talk about. Unfortunately, some other states like California, they have a ton of day programs that young adults can go to, anything from nutrition and exercise camps all the way to a place called Studio West out in West Los Angeles. It's actually run by actors. It's a day program where they teach people who have developmental disabilities how to be actors. And a lot of the people who you see on television or in commercials who have a developmental disability most likely came from that studio. So in the meantime, here in Florida, we kind of have to create some of these things for our young adults. Also talk about some of the programs that your teenager may need, and also, you know, make sure that you're looking into all of the different adult services, and I'm going to talk about some of those as we go along here. Okay, what resources are out there for adults? The short answer is it depends. Another thing to look at is your child's level of functioning. So for example, if your child's higher functioning, there may be more work-related, school-related opportunities out there for them. So for example, if I have a high-functioning child who's been diagnosed with autism before, and they're super bright, and we think that they may be able to go to school, then guess what? There's actually a lot of colleges and universities throughout the United States that actually have autism centers that are there to help equip a child with a young adult with autism to succeed in college. One of the best ones, actually, believe it or not, is in Alabama. That's one of the top ones to help with children, young adults who are on the autism succeed. Again, it kind of depends on the state you live in. Talking from the Florida perspective, we'll go over some of these, but there are other states that also have a lot of other adult programs. One of the first places to start is obviously your school district. For example, Pinellas County has actually transition services and resources. So you do want to look through all these, because you know what? The teachers don't always tell you about this. Technically, when your child is transitioning and has an IEP, they're supposed to start talking about transition services as early as age 14. Okay, so some of the things that you see here is that we're planning for our transition from high school into adult life. They actually have, like I said, career-based instruction. So, and also they're supposed to help connect your child with post-school services or agencies while they're still in high school. What I have found is that many of the high schools I've worked with are not that great about putting that out there. So it's important as parents to make sure that we're looking through all of these different services, because they do actually have the services. You just have to kind of be savvy about what are the different ones that you can. So this is a great website for those of you who are in Pinellas County to start looking at some of the different things that you can do to try and help your child with these different things. Another agency that's out there is called the Florida Agency for Persons with Disabilities. I have to tell you, when I first got here, I was hoping to infiltrate and see what services they had. I had high hopes that it was going to be like the regional center out in California, and it's not. However, it's very important, and I always tell parents that even if they're not going to do anything for you right now, you still want to apply. So if your child has a disability such as an intellectual disability, autism, cerebral palsy, anything like that, you want to go ahead and apply for the Agency for Persons with Disabilities. Here in Florida, you're placed on a waiver. However, for example, I had a 17-year-old who has autism and intellectual disability and also other genetic problems. So she's on the wait list for getting services through the Agency of Persons with Disability. So she's kind of farther down the list, but she ended up getting psychiatrically hospitalized. So that places her higher on the list. I've had many kids who, unfortunately, it's taken that, but if they were psychiatrically hospitalized, they get bumped up towards the list. In addition, when children transition to adulthood, they may have more services available, particularly looking at housing and different things like that. So even though I don't think they're super helpful for most of us at this time, you do at least want to be on it, especially if you're a single parent like me. You want to make sure that you're involved in that, because if something happens to me, then APD is going to come in and, you know, help with housing, healthcare, all those different things for my kids. So I always recommend that. Okay. One of the things I really want to talk about is a gem in the rough here in Florida that I found. I am a provider for Department of Vocational Rehabilitation Services. So this is actually a federal program. So it's not a state program, it's funded by the federal government. It's in every state. So services with vocational rehabilitation actually start at age 14. And you don't have to have a disability to be involved in what's called their STARS program. Their STARS program is already a transition to adulthood program that actually the guidance counselors at the high schools are supposed to be referring people to. However, it doesn't always happen. So one of the things I do, if I get in I've had several 15, 16, 17-year-old families come in. They don't have insurance that's going to cover psychological testing, but they know that their kid has something going on. What I do is I refer them to vocational rehabilitation, because vocational rehabilitation, what they do is that they're actually going to give you a free psychological assessment to see if your child meets the criteria to go to receive their services. Now that's really key, because remember how I talked about if you're going to get adult services, you want to make sure that you have recent and also far back records of your child having a disability. So for example, with my own son, he's now a client of vocational rehabilitation. I already had all of my paperwork ready. Jessica Dollard, who works out of the Largo office, said, well, based on the paperwork you've given me, Alex is going to be eligible for services, but would you like an updated psychological evaluation? I said, absolutely yes, because Alex is turning 18 in October. So I need updated information about his functioning level and things like that. So that way, when I go to apply for Social Security disability, I have a recent evaluation. And that's definitely what I encourage parents to do. In addition, with that, what happens is that, for example, as a psychologist, I have people come in and I do the psychological evaluation through Voc Rehab, completely free to the family. If I decide that that child or that young adult needs therapy, they're going to pay for therapy. That's a big one, because, for example, I had a 25-year-old come in. He was referred to Voc Rehab, has autism. Parents thought he was high functioning. Well, after I did his IQ testing and everything, he was not high functioning, okay? So he thought he was going to be a NASA scientist. Well, you're still living at home, you don't drive, you don't have any friends, you know, I don't think you're going to be a NASA scientist. So I recommended therapy so we could kind of lower his expectations so that we could work on him using like public transportation. Pinellas and Hillsborough County both have disabled transportation that can be used by people with disabilities who can't drive and who can't manage the bus. It's almost like an Uber service for people with disabilities. So we worked on him utilizing that, because in his head and in a lot of young adults' heads, they think they're higher functioning than what they are. And so sometimes, you know, we need the therapy to kind of say, okay, let's try and work on this. Another perfect case, I had another woman who came in. School kind of dropped the ball. Now she's 25. She works at Publix, doesn't like it. She only wants mom or grandma to drive her there. Well, mom and grandma are getting older, so, and they can't always drive her, but she didn't want to do it. So what we did is we worked in therapy on her getting on the Pinellas County Disabled Transit, where again, a car just comes up to her house. You have to plan it ahead. It's like $5. And that's going to take her back and forth to school. So we had, or to her job. So we had her practice going to like the library. Well, now she uses it all the time. So that was a big bonus. And in that way, that's not on mom's plate, you know, to try and utilize transportation with that. So some of the other information you see here, this is STARS program, any student, neurotypical or not, can be involved in this. They have a number of different types of things during non-school hours to help prepare students to get ready for college, doing applications, how to fill out a job application, you know, work readiness, what does that look like? One of the things that they do is Job-A-Palooza. There's my son Alex right there. Job-A-Palooza is something that the ARC of Tampa Bay puts on in Pinellas County in conjoint with Vocational Rehabilitation. What they do is that they have a day where community businesses come together and they show students what some of the jobs are that are out there. So for example, Home Depot came out there. That's how come Alex got this little award here. You can see he got the golden ticket because he was chosen to do a mock interview with Home Depot. Well, that got him really excited because usually he says he wants to be a CEO. A CEO of what? I am not sure, but this kind of brought him back down to reality that, oh, I could probably work at Home Depot. They also had a manufacturing company there. They had Polaris there. They also had, of course, Hooters. That was a very popular table for the boys. The Hooters girls came out to show them how to put like chicken nuggets in a basket and how to bus tables, things like that. So it's things like this and events like that that's starting to expose our teenagers and young adults to what are some of the things out there that might be possible for working. Some of the other resources that are out there that I want to remind people of, one is the Disability Rights of Florida organization. This is, I did not know we had this until I went to the CARD conference in Orlando 2 years ago. So what they are is that they are Florida's pro bono legal service that works with people who have disabilities. So for example, I have a girl who I work with who has a guide dog. And her high school was not going to let her bring the guide dog into the science teacher's room because she was highly allergic. So I referred them to Disability Rights Florida. Well, they got right on that because that is a total violation of her rights. I actually personally use them because the school bus wouldn't come into our neighborhood. And I'm assuming Roxy's going to be in school until she's 22. So I want to make sure she has transportation. So I actually was able to use Disability Rights Florida to help me with getting the school district to do what I needed them to do on their IEP. So they have an intake process where they'll hear your story, and then if they think that it's, you know, something they can take on and help you with, they'll actually get involved with that. So I was able to send Roxanne her entire IEP, so that way they were able to fight for everything that I needed to do on that. Incredibly helpful, very, very helpful, and even from my own experience. Another one, of course, is the CARD Center for Autism and Related Disabilities at USF. Really what they do is that they have a lot more different resources. So they don't actually necessarily provide the services, but they're able to give you places where that you can go to get services. So they're excellent in terms of a resource base, trying to figure out what's in the community where you can go. The other thing that also the Center for Related Disabilities does for transitioning is, in case you haven't heard about it, it's called the Learning Academy Services. This is actually on USF campus. And what they do is it actually helps prepare your young adult for whatever happens next. Maybe they're not ready to go to college, maybe they're not ready for the next step, but this is a one-year transition that actually will be paid for by Vocational Rehabilitation. If your child becomes a client of Vocational Rehabilitation, they actually pay for this service. The only thing they don't pay for is the housing part. So they do have student housing. And one of the individuals who I was doing virtual therapy with, who was at the academy, he ended up getting an internship at one of the local hospitals before everything got shut down. But he was able to get that kind of on-the-job work experience. Some of the other things that they do is that they try and work on communication skills, they work on job training skills, and also how to find meaningful employment. And they have a complete support network there. And not only that, but the teen feels like, the teen or young adult feels like they're part of the college community, but yet they're getting all of the support. Another organization that I work with, if your young adult has, I keep saying child, but it's not. If you, like the website here might be. So Autism Shifts is another agency that I work with in Tampa. It's run by Vicki Westra, and here we go. So here's Vicki and her daughter, and what she wants to do is, her goal is to make Tampa an autism-ready city. So her and I have worked with vocational rehabilitation. So she actually has some programs that help with job readiness. She actually puts on a 2-week program where the first week is learning about self-discovery. That's so that, some of our young adults who have autism have a difficult time with emotional identification, self-regulation. They don't always get to sleep on time. So the first phase of her program is all about that. They learn about self-regulation. How do I take breaks? What kinds of things calm me down? They learn about meditation. They learn about, how to calm their bodies. So that's the whole first week. The second part is understanding the business environment. So even some of our neurotypical kids could probably use this, but basically it's a whole week of understanding, and she has guest speakers who come in and talk about, for example, how are you supposed to dress? How are you supposed to dress for an interview? How are you supposed to dress when you get to work? Why should you be on time? What are appropriate topics to talk about? How long should you be taking a bathroom break? Different things like that, and also ways to advocate for yourself. So I think that's good for everyone. One of my first psychological associates who had never had what I like to call a big girl job, I had to have a talk with her about, none of us in a psychology office needs to see her belly button ring. So these are things that sometimes our young adults just don't get, and how you're supposed to behave and how you're supposed to dress when you go to work. So that's Autism Shifts, and this is actually covered by Vocational Rehabilitation. Autism Shifts also really tries to attempt to look at, what does that student or young adult want to do with their life? So one of the things that she's done is she's also partnered with other people in the community in an attempt to get some of her students placed in a job that they're going to enjoy. So she's really done a fabulous job of that. In addition, Autism Shifts also has socialization activities, usually once a month. And this is for adults who are on the autism, who are 18 and older, and also parents are welcome to come. So during COVID, she's been doing Zoom presentations, but before that, they did things like go to the Tampa Bay Yacht Club, or they would go do karaoke or different things like that. So it's a great opportunity for socialization, which is so needed for some of our adults who are on the spectrum. Some of the other resources that are out there for transition is the ARC of Tampa Bay is a great one. And for those of you who are in Pinellas County, there's also ARCs at other places, but the ARC is also for those of us who have children and young adults who may be more severe. So they offer a number of different services, including they have adult day training programs. They also are partnered with Vocational Rehabilitation, where they do supported employment programs. They do on-the-job training programs. What a lot of people don't know is that if you're a client of Voc Rehab, and they put you on the job training, the federal government actually pays that place to pay that employee. So there's no risk to the employer. So for example, one of the students who I had did some on-the-job training at Publix. The federal government actually paid her salary at no risk to Publix. Well, she figured out that she didn't like the uniform, she didn't like customer service, she didn't like being outside, so there was no risk. So we've now moved her to a different type of job, such as being in a salon. Now she's doing those types of things, and she's getting this experience, and the ARC of Tampa Bay also partners with that as well. Furthermore, for those of us who have children who are more severe, they also have residential programs where they have different houses depending on the milieu of the clients, where they actually have group homes. So and I've seen a couple of them, and they're very nice. So Again, I think that they offer a lot of great services for those of us who maybe have children. They're always going to be kids to us who are probably a little bit more severe. Another program that I've been working with is called CIP Worldwide. They have a transition program, one that's in Brevard County here in Florida. They also have a transition program in Long Beach, California. So what it is that they actually tailor to people who are on the spectrum, who have learning disabilities, who are not quite ready, or don't know what they want to do next. So I've actually done a couple of virtual assessments with people from all over the country. I'm doing one right now from an individual who's 25 who is in North Carolina because, you know, he's kind of struggled. Parents think he's on the autism spectrum, but he had a job, he couldn't handle it, and he's still living at home. So they're looking at these different types of programs, and CIP usually wants to know what the functioning level is of the child or the young adult who's going to be coming to their program. So they have a couple of locations, and I've talked to their directors and everything, and they really are pretty great in terms of if your child's gonna fit that. Another one, I'm familiar with it because I worked in California and lived there for 15 years, is the Pathways at UCLA, which is similar to CIP. I've actually, when I was working in West Los Angeles, we had people come from all over the country there. And what would happen is if they had autism, they become actually a resident of California and West Los Angeles, where UCLA is. Once they become a resident of California and they're accepted to be a regional center client out in California, they help pay for Pathways. Whereas here in Florida, that's not going to happen with CIP. But there are some other programs in other states that can be helpful as well. And these students, again, live right on the UCLA campus. Some other resources that I like to tell parents who maybe have older kids who are still having some behavior problems. You know, not all ABA therapy is just for little kids. I have a number of, these are 2 different agencies that I work with. This one actually, CARD, is out of California, where they do home-based ABA therapy. So if you think your teenager is continuing to have problems with socialization, behavior problems, things like that, these are 2 different agencies that I have found in the area that will do home-based and will work with older children and young adults. Actually, this one, ABLE, or the Applied Learning Experience, I have an 18-year-old who I just referred to them. So just because your kids are a little bit older doesn't mean that they still can't get ABA therapy. Here in Florida, I find that many of the agencies actually do more with, you know, the younger kids. So these are 2 agencies that do more with older kids. I put that usually, though, in order to get ABA therapy, you have to have the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule administered, and that's something that, as a psychologist, I'm able to do. Most insurance companies will not authorize even the pre-assessment that the behavior therapy company has to do. Okay, let's talk about Social Security while we still have time. So obviously, Social Security disability is something we want to think about as our young adults turn 18. One of the things you want to think about is, before you even go that direction, is to explore what's called a special needs trust. A special needs trust is a legal entity that you most likely will need an attorney to put together, which puts the trust so that way, for example, you can fund it, and any money that's in that trust is not going to affect your child's Social Security or Medicaid benefits. So if your child has, let's say, $5,000 that you've been saving up for him in a regular bank account, and now you go to Social Security disability, they're going to say you have to spend that down because you're only allowed to have $2,000 in cash and assets in order to be eligible for Social Security disability. So for example, I'll be working with an attorney to do a special needs trust, so that way, basically what will happen is that my life insurance will fund it. So if my life insurance, I just goes to Alex and Roxanne, the government's going to say, oh, you have all this money now, you have to use that, and that could mean that they could lose valuable benefits. So you definitely want to think about that, and that's something you really need to talk to a special needs trust attorney about. Again, like I said, if you're going to do this, you want to start getting all of the documentation now. Like I was saying before, you want to make sure that you get the psychological evaluation prior to 18. Okay, many adults are turned down the first time, especially here in Florida. So I usually don't recommend that parents get an attorney until it gets into maybe the second appeal process, just because it's so typical for that to happen. Getting Social Security is all about functioning levels, okay? Can your child manage a checkbook? Can they go grocery shopping? Can they do cleaning? What about bathing? Do they need reminders? Okay, like I said before, we like to highlight our kids' strengths. This is not the time to do it, because what's going to happen is Social Security is going to look at how those children are functioning. And if they're not, what happens is that you're not going to get Social Security disability. So for example, this is an example of one of the adaptive measures that I use. Whoops. Oh, let me go back here, sorry. So one of the things that, okay, so this is an example of the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales that look specifically at adaptive functioning. So here on this one, right here, this score, 100 is average. Anything below 70 is considered in the delayed range. So this particular person looks like their scores are super low. So we know from these scores, they're not probably going to be able to function independently. So when you fill out any forms for the government or the school district, I encourage you to think about your child's worst day ever. Because if you don't, they probably won't get the services. I had that happen with a young adult, a 25-year-old male out in California. He was able to go to college as long as he was in a structured environment, he did okay. But if he was left independent, he couldn't do it. So I had to kind of talk to the parents again. You know, can Johnny really mail a letter? Has he ever really paid a bill on his own? Well, no, I think he could. Well, no, he hasn't, so that's going to be a no. You know, things like that you really need to think about. If my child was left alone to their own devices, would they be able to do it without me nagging, without, you know, totally on their own? Most likely, if it's a no, you want to make sure you put that, because otherwise they're not going to be eligible. If you have an adult child right now, or if your child's almost 17 and a half, one of the things you can do is you can go to socialsecurity.gov and make sure that you start filling out that information now. Okay, guardianship. Do I do it? Do I not do it? Do we have a question here? Okay. Do I do it? Do I not do it? So, and what does it mean? How do I do it? Is it necessary? And how will my child respond? So once your child turns 18, it's important to know that they're an adult then, okay? So what that means is you're not gonna have any say unless you have guardianship for your child, okay? So for example, I was in an IEP in California. The person had an intellectual disability, and he had sexually inappropriate behavior. We had discussed residential treatment planning through the school district. We were all in agreement. We get to the IEP. He's 18 and mom doesn't have guardianship. So guess what? They have to take into consideration what he wants, because he's not guardianship. There's no guardianship or conservatorship. So all of those different things, for example, I like to tell parents, how you kind of describe it to your kid is, you know, if you go to the hospital and you're 18 and I don't have guardianship, you know how usually mom gives the doctor, you know, the insurance card? Do you know how to do that? You know, do you know how to write a check? Have you ever written any bills? You know, I try and make it so that the child has an understanding that, geez, once I turn 18, I'm in charge of all this stuff. If there's an emergency and your child's 18 and you don't have guardianship or some type of power of attorney, guess what? No one has to listen to you. It's all about whatever that 18-year-old adult wants, okay? That includes school decisions as well. So some of the things that you can look at is that there's the more restriction, which is guardianship, which just basically means you're not taking your child's rights away, but you have a right to help manage, you know, their aspects of life. You can also, in terms of baking, some of this information you can actually get on the website, the USF card website. This particular packet right here, you can download for free. It talks all about the different options for guardianship and why those are so important and what the different types are. So I encourage you to really look through that. But basically, some of the other options include power of attorney. So like, for example, if I wasn't going to get guardianship for Alex, which I will, I would have him sign a power of attorney for medical and financial issues. So that way I would also have a say, and I wouldn't have to have him sign a release of information. And in case, God forbid, he's mad at me one day and doesn't want to, let me talk to the doctor, I still have that in place. So there's a number of different options for that type of thing. So these are some of the things that I talk to adult kids about when I encourage guardianship. Are you going to pay your own bills? When you go to the hospital and doctor's office, they might not let mom or dad in there. Are you gonna be able to handle that? Also dealing with law enforcement. Finally, real quick, dealing with the emotional aspect of having a child who's an adult with a disability. One of the things I always encourage families to do is to make sure you have support and have your tribe. And what I mean by that is that, I'm a single parent, but I have friends who my kids totally respect. And when I'm done dealing with them and I need to tap out, I'll text them and say, can you please call Alex? I just can't deal with this anymore. So I encourage you to have somebody like that. The other thing emotionally is don't try and keep up with the Joneses, because it's just too emotionally difficult. You need to focus on your own life and your own game. One of the final things I'll talk about is Aaron's House. Aaron's House is a nonprofit group that was started by Pamela Robinson, who we have a support group that's right now virtual 3 times a month. And then we also have a private Facebook page. It's usually mothers or fathers who are caring for either a child with a mental health problem or a developmental disability. This is a picture of her son, Aaron, who unfortunately died of an accident during a psychotic break because of bipolar disorder. So she kind of threw all of her energies into that. So I encourage you to look into that. Finally, this is Roxy. Like I said, they grow up fast. Roxy still loves Chuck E. Cheese pizza. She doesn't want to play the games anymore, but there she is. So finally, this is my information. I'm Dr. Melissa Bailey. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you would like to email me. I offer services both in person and virtually. I'm actually able to do an entire psychological assessment virtually because of the different platforms that I use. I'm able to share my screen just like we did today. I've already done psychological evaluations for people like in North Carolina, Texas, who want places like CAP or those other things. I really want to thank Rory and Phyllis for allowing me to come in and to share all of my information.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. This is Sarah with Bright Feets.
Of course, thank you for having me.
So it looks like we had a comment from Sandy when you were talking about high school graduation. She said, make sure they defer their diploma to have access to services after graduation. And then we had a question from Mary. I know that we touched on SSDI. She asked if you could talk more about SSI. She said, we have never applied for SSI, but he may need it as an adult, he being her son.
Again, yes, usually with SSI, as an adult, you do want to make sure that you have documentation. One of the things that I recommend that lawyers are not going to tell you if you go in and apply for that is that you're going to get a letter from a case manager that's managing your case. So disability is defined as whether or not you're going to have that issue for 12 months or more. If you're not going to have that issue for 12 months or more, it's not, they don't consider long-term disability. So when you're filling out paperwork, you want to make sure you use terms like for the past several years, since he was a child, things like that. In addition, you're looking at that functioning level as well. When you get that case manager's number, you want to start blowing up the phone. So for example, I have an adult right now who's 25, no, he's 20 who I'm trying to get SSI for. So he had a change in medication. I told mom, or I told him and mom, all right, you call up that person. All right, my psychiatrist just upped my medication. All right, my psychologist wants me to come in 3 times a week. I just went to the emergency room because I had a panic attack. because they record all of those. And what happens is that's going to continue to build your case that your child or your young adult needs Social Security benefits.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey.
Thank you.
So Sandy asked another question. She said, do you have recommendations on things to have private schools use to document issues your child has? Some are addressed by the nature of the school and aren't documented in the IEP, as the district doesn't put things in they can't enforce. My son has had meltdowns and shutdowns at school. What do I need them to include in his records to help when I apply for SSI or SSDI? He has a normal IQ.
Okay, so he may have a normal IQ, but some of the things that you might also find is you do want to make sure that you're having your private school document those, even if it's just in maybe a note home or an email or something. You want all of those things somehow documented, and that, you know, if they send notes home, keep all those notes. If they're calling you, make a log of all the times that the teachers called you. So you want to make sure that, you know, an email record, anything like that. In addition, if the school is not managing his behavior, you know, another thing I would do is call the Disability Rights of Florida, because they may be able to help out with that as well.
Okay, do we have any other questions? So they manage his behavior. They are afraid of making him look bad.
Well, then they need to have them write what they're doing to manage his behavior. And again, if they're doing things to manage it, how much are they doing to manage it? And that needs to be documented somewhere. Because sometimes private schools, they don't want to document that stuff, because they don't want themselves to look bad either for incoming families as well. Yes, it's okay for you to, I would definitely document and ask for documentation, and, you know, ask to have your notes put into his school record, so that when SSI asks for his school records, all of that is in there. You can say, that's fine, but I want to add some notes to his school record, and you can do that. Also, if he's seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist, make sure they're documenting it as well. So, you know, if he's also seeing an outside provider, have them also document all of that information. Make sure they're putting in their notes that, you know, Johnny continues to have a difficult time in school. He's having meltdowns and things like that. So that's also documented on someone else's notes. But you can also always ask to have your notes added to the school record as well.